to over the next 55 or so minutes. Um, just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can open the chat feature of Zoom, which should be down below. And yeah, just shoot us any questions. I'll try and keep an eye on those, and we'll save some time at the end to, if you have anything you want to know about Pete or his work. But let's get into it. So this is a really fantastic book, and I think one of the things that you do really well is articulate exactly what it is you're trying to do, and you sort of succeeded doing it as well. So early on you write, "This South Bronx, the product of a discourse, is more a projection than a real place, an invention of many needful imaginations. The political right, paranoids, racists, suburbanites, downtowners, out-of-towners, to name but a few. Entire vocabularies were honed in order to describe places like the Bronx. Terms like blight, slum, inner city, and the ghetto. A veritable lexicon of urban decline enabled advocates of urban renewal, yet another euphemistic term to reorganize and segregate cities across the nation, physically displacing certain populations from neighborhoods." Now, this is an incredibly ambitious project, sort of trying to dispel and disentangle all of these discourses, all of these mythologies. And I'm always curious about a project's origins. There's so many ways to approach a story about the Bronx. What was it about sort of space, or the spatiality of it, or the sort of geographical approach that appealed to you? Where did this project come from?
Well, that's a extraordinarily ambitious first question as well. So before I get started answering, I want to thank Maris, thank McNally Jackson, and thank you for doing this. But yeah, in terms of thinking about where my fascination with space came from, no, I was always, I mean, there's a few places that I can draw that to, but I've always been fascinated by mythologies surrounding place names. And a lot of this comes, perhaps unsurprisingly, from a similar fascination with rap music. But I mean, just in terms of the ways that place names were always particularly important to folks on songs. There's a way that like a place like Linden Boulevard or so would like resonate, you know, when you heard it shouted on a record, or if you heard the line like a couple of years ago on Headland and Low was the start of something good. Like, you know, I've spent, you know, many an hour just imagining like what could possibly have happened on this like magical street corner, when in reality it's probably just like a street corner like any other corner. But when you're listening to the song, you don't know that, and you know, it's that kind of fascination or with mythologies about place. Places like Holly Grove, Compton, Harlem, the South Bronx, obviously. You know, in the context of rap songs, these places were like almost entire moods, even if they were entirely imagined moods. You know, and so in thinking about a project like this, you know, the one way that you could look at it is looking at individual representations, you know, and that a work like that would be interesting. But I was sort of more always interested in how some art for some artists, for some rap artists or any artists in general, like representing took on a kind of double functioning element. Mm-hmm. There's both like a sort of pride in claiming that name, claiming that myth, you know, kind of braggadocio, like the idea that one has survived that place, but also as a kind of a source of narrative, whether it's a mythological one or even, you know, burnishing one's own legend, so to speak. In terms of thinking about that, you know, thinking about how, you know, a simple utterance could become an entire idea, or even like a way of being with, and you know, coming back to like an idea like the South Bronx. So that's like one sort of influence for the book. Another main influence was the other real OG in the game, Marshall Berman. And so a lot of what inspired my like thinking about that it was possible to even write a book about the Bronx was reading, the first time I read All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, When you read that, one learns a lot about like how crippling modernization and by extension like how crippling capitalism can be. But it's also really the first time that I'd seen the Bronx written about in a sort of academical kind of mode. And I mean, in particular, the last chapter of All That Is Solid Melts into Air, maybe even just the last section, sort of spends a great deal of time excoriating the quote unquote master builder, Robert Moses, for destroying the Bronx of Marshall Berman's youth by ripping the Cross Bronx Expressway right through its heart, right through all of these extant neighborhoods. And you wrote about it with such passion, but also, both lovingly, but also, quite in this like stunning academical mode where, when upon reading it, I didn't know that one could do such a thing. Mm-hmm. So that was like also just really formative in terms of, thinking about, you can write about something that's like both personal and political and, something that is both inside and outside of yourself in a kind of way. And lastly, maybe just in terms of the particular passage I think that you read, which again, it's always weird hearing yourself read to yourself, but
like, that was pretty good.
Yeah, right. Did I actually write that? But in terms of not only that moment of listening to yourself, but that has to do with a particular kind of fascination with language and a fascination with like the particularities of language. You and I have a mutual friend, George Blaustein, who's very particular about language and has like very clear likes and dislikes of things, some of which I share. But in terms of like these particular phrases like inner city, the ghetto, blight, slum, or like no man's land, as a person like who's interested in space, I was interested in how poorly these terms serve as descriptors. Mm-hmm. And that's mainly because they serve as euphemisms. They're like coded signifiers for race. They're what you say when you don't want to say a whole bunch of other problematic things. They work on the level of like how do you define the inner city? It works more on the level of that old Justice Potter Stewart thing of like
Mm-hmm.
you know it when you see it. These are things that describe like problems that are so entrenched or complex that they sort of produce their own willful distancing via language. Shout out to Viva, that's my daughter who's in the background.
Well, allow me to read some more beautiful prose, which is also from your book. Now, there's obviously a personal dimension to this book, as you mentioned, and in the introduction you write that symbolic Bronx loomed large over my youth. Saying one was from the Bronx meant certain things. One received certain looks in response depending on the respondent. I was curious to see how far the shadow of that symbol stretched. So, you don't really write about this as much within the text itself, but I'm just curious about, there is that saying that every sort of academic's first book has this seed in sort of like autobiographical experience, or just sort of like how you're seeing the world in that moment, even if it doesn't come out on the page. How did that sort of weave into this? What were those sort of moments when you realized that you were living sort of in this physical space with people, with your family, but also living within this myth as well?
So, I mean, maybe, there's one like actual literal thing that I did experience that I do write about, that I think as a careful reader of the book you pointed out, comes very, very close to the end, and I basically skip over it. But I do remember driving, I wasn't driving, but sitting in the back seat of my parents' car and driving through, I think this memory comes as we were driving on the elevated part of the Bruckner Expressway. But I'm sure we also drove up across the South Bronx a bunch of different times. But I do actually remember seeing these really strange looking drawings in the windows of buildings that sort of lined the higher part, the elevated part of the expressway. And these are window decals that the city of New York had put into abandoned buildings in the late 70s and early 80s in order to kind of, as Ed Koch put it, kind of put these buildings into cold storage. So there were just too many. The scale of building abandonment was so great that the city essentially put up these drawings of fake shutters, fake flower pots, in sort of really simplistically rendered interiors in the windows, both, to beautify, so to speak, the neighborhoods, but also it was in a very calculated way that, as I said, a lot of the ones that I saw were lining the expressways so that, I grew up in the Bronx, but like someone who was maybe commuting from Connecticut to the city, might not notice. I mean, it's not as if these trompe-l'oeil were like really lovingly rendered. Like if you stared at them for any longer than a second, you'd know that that was not a beautiful flower in the window.
Yeah.
But that's actually like, something that I did see and I do write about in the book. But I suppose more in terms of the broader notion of like where I end and where the myth begins, I guess, of the Bronx, that is, not of me. I don't know. I mean, the myth of the Bronx, it kind of begins in the name, in a sense. Like there's a mystique to saying it. I mean, the definite article carries a certain weight, within the ecosystem of New York City, and maybe even particularly like the smaller ecosystem of New York City schools. You learn various hierarchies, how things connect, how they don't. What it means to say you're from a particular place or that you're from somewhere, and how that name, quote unquote, rings out.
Right.
But the sort of the reactions of other people, that I think is really key in this sense. I mean, the way that you were describing that sort of twin notion of having a sense of yourself, but also having a sense of what it is people think when they hear where it is you're from. I think, that strangely sounds like a kind of Bronx double consciousness.
Right.
How you see and relate to the world, and then how people see and imagine you based on whatever mythologies they attach to that particular place. One ever feels his two-ness, I guess.
Now, the book begins in 1977. I mean, the opening chapters set in 1977 on Charlotte Street. And, I've never mastered the whole screen sharing thing, so I've just have it as my background. This gives you a sense of the image that we'll be talking about, okay? A very famous image. Can you set the scene for us? Like precisely one of these very famous named places in the South Bronx is Charlotte Street. It's the type of place that might have entranced or terrified people from afar. People who are sort of reading the official narratives of space a little blindly. So can you set the scene for us? What was Charlotte Street historically? What was the South Bronx like in 1977 when this memorandum that you write about is sent to President Carter, which ends in this photo op?
Thanks so much for putting up that image there. It's a lot easier to talk from an image. But yeah, that is a photograph of Jimmy Carter, at the time, the lame duck mayor of New York City, Abe Beame, and also Patricia Harris, who was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Just the stylish looking one in the center, just behind Hua's left, giving Hua the shoulder there. But this particular picture was particularly resonant. And Charlotte Street, just to back up a little bit, is it's a place that Carter in 1977 and Ronald Reagan in 1980 during the presidential during the run up to the election, and many other politicians often visited. It became this incredibly resonant place to have a photo op taken. But it also just became was seen at this point in 1977 as the sort of quote unquote epicenter of urban ruin. It was essentially like a 6-block area that looked a lot like what's behind Qua right now. A 6-block area of rubble, abandoned buildings that was, as I mentioned, used both as a political backdrop and, at the end of the book, as I mentioned, this particular place kind of reaches, I don't know if apotheosis is the right word, but it's both a high and low point as a Hollywood backdrop for two particular films who shot on location on Charlotte Street, in the ruin of Charlotte Street. But essentially, this photograph takes place in the wake of the 1977 blackout. This photograph was taken in October, so the blackout happened in July of that year. And at this point, the Bronx and not just Charlotte Street, but the borough was sort of seen as quote unquote America's inner city. And this was the product of many things, of not just as Marshall Berman would have it, the driving of the Cross Bronx through the center of the borough, but the deterioration of its housing stock, the deindustrialization of a deindustrialized economy, which led to a host of lost jobs. The mass migration of Black and brown folk to the city, looking for those jobs that were not there anymore. And of course, the mass exodus of white folks from the Bronx to live there, as opposed to what we could call today a suburban lifestyle dream somewhere else.
Good topical reference.
Thanks, bro. But this was also a time when governments began to experiment with austerity measures and began to sort of invest in disinvestment in urban centers. So given all that backdrop, into this fray walks Jimmy Carter on a 2-day visit to New York City and the UN. His staffers, some of whom you can see behind Hua, suggest to him that he go visit the South Bronx because essentially it would be a really bad look if he went to New York and didn't, because he had been there a few times before. And the Bronx already had this sort of resonant reputation. It had appeared in Bill Moyer's documentary earlier that year in March called The Fire Next Door, referencing, of course, the famous James Baldwin book, The Fire Next Time. And even back as far as 1972, the BBC had produced a documentary called Man Alive, The Bronx is Burning, which is actually influential for something that I'm about to get to in a minute. But this is all to say that the particular memo that you referenced that I write about was written by Patricia Harris, who's center in that photograph. And she writes this really lovingly, what I think is pretty poetic memo. I mean, poetic in the sense of both in terms of how she thinks about the Bronx and how she, makes a really forceful case to the president. In this moment, back sort of when the government actually used to employ people in all of the jobs that a government usually employs people, and they actually do their jobs lovingly. But back to particular matters. One of the reasons why I think that this memo is so why I was struck by it so much is I really it's lovely to think of people taking the time to sort of inject style into statecraft in a way. People who take the time to sort of make something beautiful out of bureaucracy. But she also and one of the ways that she does that is to sort of, put the visit into really stark terms, not just in terms of defending the right of people who can't speak for themselves, to have an urban life, to live in a particular place and to find work and find homes, et cetera, et cetera. But also she puts it into these really incredibly stark terms about this being not just about the South Bronx, but about sort of the fate of America's cities. That if America can't keep its perhaps best and most famous city, if this is what parts of that city look like, then what hope do we have for all of America's cities? And so there's a way that she was looking both at the South Bronx as a particular case, but also as the South Bronx as being representative of all of America's cities and all of America's urban centers, inner city or not.
Allow me to vector off what you just said. You had this really wonderful way of saying that what Harris was doing was injecting some sort of beauty within the bureaucracy. I think that's what you said. And it strikes me that a lot of bureaucrats and sort of government officials during this time were just doing the bare minimum, right? If that. And I think that's why the decals you were talking about are such a sort of incredible kind of mind-blowing aspect of all of this. So let's start there. What was Ed Koch's Boxmobile, and how did this logic later find purpose when he became mayor of New York City?
Yeah, so to talk about the Boxmobile is maybe another way of talking about what these strange decals that I happened to see on a few youthful drives through the city. What was their origin story, if we're going to get real superhero with it? I mean, there are like competing origin stories for these decals, but one being in 1961, during a time when like Ed Koch, a younger Ed Koch, sort of took a year off from law and politics. Allow me to vector off to tell a bad joke. Young Koch sounds like a really dope rapper name that no one ever picked up, but it's out there now for everyone.
Just credit this book talk if you
please do.
If you run with it. Yeah.
But a young Koch applied for a patent for something called the simulated vehicle toy, aka the Boxmobile, which was essentially like a set of decals that could be affixed to a box to make it look like either a car or a train, like a locomotive. And this is the historian Jonathan Soffer suggests that the New York City municipal decal idea may have been like a Koch invention, or it may have been like an outgrowth of this Boxmobile, which, I mean, I would love to believe. That would be great. And the funny thing is that, all of the origin stories for these municipal trompe l'oeil are just as potentially apocryphal. Another one that I managed to find suggests that one enterprising housing and urban development worker who was putting up essentially these decals went on, they sort of filled in the windows and they put like tin over that, and then oftentimes they affixed the decals to this like tin covering that covered the exterior of the window.
But it was just just so people understand, it was just like a terrible drawing of a window that went over like a broken window, right? Or there'd be a silhouette of a person just stationary.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, they were designed. Yeah. Exactly, they were designed. I mean, in the way that I saw them as a kid was probably the intended way that they were meant to be seen, which is at speed, driving by, or perhaps like walking by in a neighborhood when you just casually happen to look up. I mean, they're meant to just adorn essentially what has already been like walled off. And this other story suggests that like just some enterprising worker painted one day, and that their supervisor came out to the site to supervise, I suppose, and like couldn't find the place where he was supposed to find the rest of his workers, because he ended up driving by the building because the the Trump lawyer was like so convincing to him. So in that sense, I mean, those are two stories that I would love to believe are true. I don't know exactly like who came up with the idea, but you know, they are these like very, very strange, potentially troubling, but also, you know, sometimes for the people who did live in these neighborhoods, who might have lived next to an abandoned building, they actually served like a useful purpose, despite the fact that like they created what were essentially Potemkin villages of the Bronx.
Well, what was the purpose though? I mean, because it seems like, you know, the city isn't going to actually do anything to improve the lives of people who live there. They're not going to encourage people to move to these abandoned buildings. Like, what is the purpose then of having these of having these decals?
Well, I mean, a lot of the city officials. I mean, one of the things that city officials often said in their when asked like very, very similar questions, or these particular questions, is that perception was reality. That you know, the city at that time was facing like a huge budget crisis, and didn't have the money to be able to fix all of these buildings, certainly not at the same time. I mean, the scale of abandonment and destruction was quite large, and so these were essentially stopgaps. And you know, again, it's hard to describe how apt the phrase "not a good look" is in this case, because they were neither good looking, nor is that like a good look for the borough or for the city or for the municipality. But they, you know, it's hard, but it's also hard to damn them entirely, because they did serve a purpose. I mean, I watched a bunch of old NBC news clips of like local news of interviewing people who grew up in the neighborhoods, or who happened to live next to a building that had these decals. And a lot of folks, you know, expressed both, you know, they preferred that as opposed to having a sort of empty, semi-terrifying building that they had to walk by every day, perhaps, you know, coming home at night. But at the same time, a lot of them realized they're like, well, they should really just fix them and have people move in.
Yeah.
But I suppose this is as good as we're going to get. But that, you know, again, that's an indictment of the city and what they were choosing to spend their money on.
Now, you just raised an interesting point, which is that even though the popular impression that a lot of people worldwide had of the South Bronx was that this was a sort of, you know, a zone that had been so thoroughly neglected that it had no value at all. You know, you're pointing out that there is still a lot of kind of nascent value there. And I think one of the archives that you look into that I found particularly intriguing was the tax assessment images. And I think the question here is sort of like, what were the tax assessment images, and what do they suggest about whether or not these were actually like quote unquote ruins or spaces devoid of value?
So the tax photos that I write about is this really fascinating archive, of which there are two main collections. One was taken in the 1930s and 1940s, and they're these really gorgeous black and white images that are, you know, they're all at the Municipal Archives in New York, downtown, at the Surrogates Court Building, which, if you have never been to the Surrogates Court Building, is one of the most beautiful interiors that you can find in the city. But the earlier version of the tax photos are essentially like, the tax photos in general are like visual data points for tax assessment. So both in the 1930s and the 1980s, the city decided they needed to have this kind of visual element to be able to do a more accurate form of tax assessment. And the 1930s and 40s images now serve as this kind of archive for folks who want to see, say, like the building that their grandfather grew up in on the Lower East Side. And so you can go and have the municipal archives, print you out like a really lovely like print of that particular building. By the 1970s and 1980s, that archive, which was an active one for the city, had grown horribly. It was terribly inaccurate, both the assessments and the photographs themselves. So the city contracted to do it again. And that's actually the archive that I write about, because the mandate of the city was to photograph every block and lot in the city, which resulted in like 800,000 or so photographs. I'm sorry, even more, I think 800 to 900,000 photographs. And the Bronx ones serve because, as we've seen already, thanks to Hua, a little bit of what the Bronx looked like at the time. And so, unintentionally, this archive serves as a kind of archive of Bronx ruin, which isn't something that suggests that the entirety of the Bronx was a ruin. Which, of course, actually the archive proves the opposite of that. Like you can search the archive and look at. There's a tax photo for Yankee Stadium. There's a tax, there are tax photos for sections of the highway. There are tax photos for like Van Cortlandt Park. So you can see beautiful images. You can see like all of the images aren't entirely ones where there are like lunar landscapes, perhaps like the ones that are floating behind Hua right now.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't know why that just happened. It's still a lunar landscape behind me.
It's more of a aurora borealis.
Okay, all right. My apologies.
No, quite all right. Could you bring us back? I think I'm floating.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I was I was actually trying to get this image of Yankee Stadium behind me, but we've ended up in outer space, or just somewhere in the Great North or something. Okay, so we have these images, and I think it's fascinating just innately, even though I've been to a bar in New York City, so I've seen those pictures of like, this is what used to be here in the 1930s. Like we're familiar with these images. It's just strange to me that these were tax assessment images, and that it still suggests that the land underneath this quote unquote blight still possess value, and I think what's really intriguing about the project is you have these official archives, right? The tax assessment images, you have these official expressions of making place, right? Like these like terribly crude window decals. Like when you see them, they would only make sense to you in a speeding car. But what your book really wonderfully does is it just sort of toggles back and forth between the official rendering, the popular one, the bestseller, the thing that became kind of zeitgeisty. And then there's the other one, maybe not in direct response, but there are artists, texts, cultural expressions that kind of rub against that official story. Can you talk a bit about that juxtaposition? Because each of the chapters has that dynamic where there's like the tax assessment images, and then there's sort of journalistic documentary photo. There's the decals, and then Gordon Matta Clark, right? Mm-hmm. So could you talk a bit about what juxtaposition gets us, like looking at two things that aren't actually in direct conversation with one another, but just sort of revolve around the same thing? And then maybe we could talk a bit about Gordon Matta Clark, another image that hopefully will show up behind me.
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas about GMC, but I mean, I think in terms of thinking about juxtaposition, and like why that is sort of like an ethic cool. of the book. And I think a lot of it comes out of really liking art history lectures, mm-hmm. Both as an undergrad and later on. I just was always fascinated by like how like the most skilled instructors, worked often by a juxtaposition of images, like would throw up two images of two things that looked, almost nothing alike. And then either by the end of the lecture or even, by the end of like that discussing that particular comparison, as a student, I would sit there and these two things would sort of be brought into one, or one image would be used to explain the other. And that to me always just seemed like a really effective, well, first of all, it was a really impressive, it was really impressive on the part of the instructor. It also seemed to me like a really effective way of teaching, of not only teaching, but of, finding one thing in the other. And, it was both difficult, and I guess I like difficult things. But it was something that, seemed like a useful way to explain something. But with regard to something like Gordon Matta Clark and the municipal window decals, both of these subjects are individually fascinating to me and were when I started out in the research. And it was really only in spending time with them that I realized that, I might be able to discuss them both, through this figure of the trompe l'oeil, like, this idea of like, staying like fooling the eye in some particular way. But, the photographs that, or one of the photographs that Paul has behind him now is from Gordon Matta Clark's window Blowout, which is a part of this sort of installation piece that he had installed at a downtown gallery, which consisted of photographs of broken windows in New York, or particularly in the Bronx. And one of the things that he had installed all of these particular photographs in the gallery, and then at a certain point that evening, between when he had finished installing and when the show was supposed to open up the next night, or the next morning, sorry, he shot out all of the actual windows of the gallery with an air gun. Mm-hmm. And so then, but the next morning, the gallery owners were horrified. Peter Eisenman, the architect, who was, I think, running part of the gallery, was involved in this particular show, was particularly horrified. In fact, he compared it to Kristallnacht, and the art historian Thomas Crow observes that sort of Eisenman's reaction was essentially completed Gordon Matta Clark's work, mm-hmm. in that the fact that all of these photographs of the Bronx were there. No one raised a finger or cared about them when these windows were broken enough for Matta Clark to like troop all around the Bronx and take these photographs. That was a situation that was allowed to stand. Yet, the fact that this gallery's windows were, by the time of the opening, the next evening of Matta Clark's show, all of the windows had been fixed by window glaziers. And so, it's just highlighted this like essential disjuncture and like who cares about what populations and what places, and how quickly some things are fixed when other things are allowed to live in this particular, to live on in this way. So like thinking about an artist like that in conjunction who is trying to point our attention to situations like this, and and also just using like the actual figure of the window mm-hmm. as a main point of his art, making windows through walls and making windows through floors, et cetera, using that as a way to link to this entirely different but related art project, I'd say, that was also deeply related to perception, but perhaps like of a different kind, that maybe mm-hmm. tried to get you to look away, or perhaps to look past, as opposed to like look at in sort of the way that Matta Clark was trying to direct folks.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage folks, buy the book. And one of the things the book really does well is kind of beautifully put these things in conversation. And the fact that Gordon Matta Clark, this artist whose, works were more about kind of remaking a space or just sort of making you understand the lived experience of that space a bit differently, could be put in conversation with these window decals. And this all sort of predates even this idea of broken windows policing that became really familiar in the 1980s and 90s and sort of lives on to today. The book is just really filled with these beautiful moments of kind of generative tension that come across when you put these two things that aren't necessarily alike next to each other. And, that's how discourse works, right? Like someone says something, someone responds, and even if they're not in conversation with one another, that aggregates and that layers, and that sort of becomes a perception that becomes a reality. One of the last things I want to talk to you about, my favorite chapter in the book introduces this idea of the global Bronx. Can you talk a bit about that? It's an idea that grows out of another truly fascinating moment of kind of like place and art making, and our friend Stefan Eintz.
Yeah, sure. I also really just like thinking about the idea of a global Bronx.
Yeah.
But in particular, what I mean to say by that in that chapter, which is about a different gallery, a gallery uptown in the Bronx, on Third Avenue, called Fashion Moda, which is established by Stefan Eintz. In 1978. But the particular thing that I write about in A Global Bronx, the name of the chapter, is the time when Fashion Moda essentially went international and took a trip to Documenta, which is this massive international art exhibition, which takes place in Kassel, Germany. This was in 1982. I think this was the 7th iteration of Documenta. And so Fashion Moda was invited, Stefan Eintz and Jenny Holzer were invited on and Fashion Moda sort of came with them. And what they did was they established these like stores essentially at the art fair and sold these like really low cost multiples, like things like T-shirts, pieces of stationery with posters and other assorted small items. I think anywhere from like a few dollars. I think maybe the most expensive thing was $200. But there were these low cost multiples that sort of laid bare the idea of how commercial the entire enterprise of an art fair is. And a lot of the art, was representative of the Bronx. That like lots of images, perhaps of lone tenements, so to speak, and maybe the idea of the abandoned building that you think of, maybe when you think of what the South Bronx looked like. And so there's a way that what Eintz and the Fashion Moda stores did at Documenta was to kind of sell this version of site specificity that entirely relied upon like the myth and reality, or the blending of the myth and reality of the Bronx. Like what is it that folks who go to an international art exhibition, maybe mostly European folks who are showing up in Kassel, Germany, what is it that they're buying when they show up to the Fashion Moda store? What ideas of America, of New York City, of the Bronx, like were on sale when you buy like a tiny little multiple? I think they're like both like these deeply, we were talking a little bit before about like what notions one has when they think about like ruin or urban ruin in particular, that maybe it's this like deeply romantic notion, but also there's the idea that like that space is also tied to, like in the way that the tax photos do, tied to like the city. That it's the ruin in the Bronx was also real estate. But back to the idea of the global Bronx, like another way that, in addition to this particular small instance of Fashion Moda going to this international art exhibition, Fashion Moda was also really influential in graffiti, sort of being broadcast out into the art world in particular. Graffiti had already been sort of broadcasting itself via the New York City subways and walls and et cetera, et cetera. But there's a way that graffiti is not just through the figure of Fashion Moda, but graffiti is kind of one way that the Bronx kind of truly went global. I mean, hip hop is, of course, the other way, but graffiti, of course, is also part of hip hop. And there's this way that, like, I mean, we can see that not only the graffiti was a thing that brought American or Bronx artists to places that perhaps they had never even imagined. In the early days of graffiti, that place might have been like Brooklyn if you grew up in the Bronx.
Right.
But that brought graffiti kids out to like Brussels or like Antwerp or all these kind of places that they couldn't even have pointed to on a map. But also in the way that, like, the different wild styles of graffiti that grew up in the Bronx and elsewhere in New York became even wilder in other places. Like, think about like the one of my favorite international forms of graffiti, like the pichação style of graffiti from Sao Paulo. Like, everybody invented their own way of doing something, but all born from this particular place.
I'm gonna hold off. I have so many more questions based on what you just said, and just in the interest of time, I think those who are interested in the book, you should definitely check it out. There's a lot on cinema, a lot on literature. There isn't actually that much on hip hop, which I wanted to get into at a certain point, but I think you sort of preempted that question when talking about Fashion Moda and how this was actually the first moment when the sort of idea of the Bronx begins to circulate globally. Like, this is actually predating the rise of hip hop, for example. So I guess the last question, and then there's some questions in the chat to my left, is what do people think of when they think of the Bronx now? Like, your book takes place largely in the late 70s into the early 80s. In the late 70s, they would think about Yankee Stadium, the sort of like apocryphal Bronx is burning thing with Howard Cosell. They would think about Charlotte Street. In the 80s, maybe they would think about Fort Apache, different movies or different books that are being written about the space. Later on, they would think about hip hop, graffiti, things like that. What do you think people think of when they think about the Bronx now?
It's a good question. I mean, the Bronx is still, the South Bronx is still the poorest congressional district in the nation. But at the same time, like, the Bronx doesn't look at all like it did in the earlier photo that you showed. But I think now it's kind of crazy that when people think of the Bronx, they might think of a place that has two of the most progressive politicians in the nation, one being sitting and laughing right behind Pa's right shoulder. And I mean, I would be remiss if I did not mention that Jesus and Miro have certainly, I think, transformed, in some senses, people's imagination for what the Bronx is and what the Bronx is like. I mean, I know that I can say, I mean, and I think you probably would share this, Hua. They've certainly put the Bronx on the map in ways that, like, induce pride in both Bronxites and New Yorkers writ large. But I think also that are, especially like on their podcast, for instance, are totally mystifying for people who don't get the specificity of their references. And so I think, it's crazy that, I think they also, in the best way, I think, engage with the, like, myths and realities of the Bronx, and make use of them in particular ways that I think are, make it entertaining for all of us. But I would also be remiss if I didn't show off my Jamal Bowman T-shirt right here, from my home district.
Well done.
So I think I remember Elliot Engel from when I was in Little League. So it's nice to have like a different politician, especially one that can like cite Wu-Tang lyrics.
A question from Max Goldberg, which sort of follows up on this. What you've talked about how the name South Bronx rang out internationally when the neighborhood was at its peak in this moment. What do you make of the geographic area's new names, reconstructions like Sobro or the Piano District, now that it's gentrifying?
Yeah, I mean, I can say in particular for the first name that you mentioned, which is like incredibly painful to even say, like to even say the word Sobro.
Mm-hmm.
It was also really hard to sit down and print. I did mention it in the conclusion of the book. But yeah, I mean, it's both enormously painful, but it's also like I mean, that that's how real estate does. And you know, but a lot of the neighborhood districts that we, you know, sort of casually use today were, you know, invented by some evil genius, you know, not too long ago. So I know it's troubling, and you know, I could definitely see from my window in New York, huge towers, huge luxury towers going up in Port Morris. That, you know, I'm sure I have some small percentage of affordable housing, but I think for the most part are market rate and above. And you know, I think in that sense, you know, that's both troubling, but at the same time, walking through neighborhoods like Port Morris, there's cool, you know, brown and black owned shops like Bronx Native that, you know, sort of engage with this figure of ruin and flip it in ways that, like, you know, actually perhaps are beneficial to the folks that actually live in the Bronx. And so, I mean, I think it's a kind of push or pull thing. I mean, the names are always going to be rough, but I mean, that's also, you know, just this reminds me that, like, the very name South Bronx is the product of, like, an agglomeration of individual places that were once like Port Morris or Morrisania, Melrose, like, were individual neighborhoods, Hunts Point. You know, these are the particular places that people came from. Like, no one, you know, sort of in the 1940s, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s ever said that they were from the South Bronx. You know, they would say, like, they were from a particular place, like Kingsbridge or Fordham or something like that. You know, that was also not an invention of real estate, but more, you know, the idea of the South Bronx as a term is another one of those kind of urban legends, and that it was something like imposed from without.
This is very embarrassing, but my computer is froze. So if you could open the chat, I can't. A lot of the questions are getting cut off for me, and you can just pick one or two to answer in the time we have remaining.
I am also here if you need me.
Okay, sure. Yeah, my computer sucks.
Yeah.
So
Maybe Maris, would you pick a question? I don't want to show any rank favoritism.
Yes.
People that
yeah,
may have
so I'm
asked the question.
sorry.
Here's a good one from Jack Halberstam. Do you cover any of the subcultural queer scenes in the Bronx at this time, maybe through the work of Bronx native Alvin Beltrap or others?
No. Alvin Beltrap is incredible, but unfortunately, yeah, my book is only so long. I hope that there'll be room. I mean, you know, this is but a really short, like, I don't claim to write about, like, the massive spectrum that the Bronx is. These are only a few sort of different case studies. A lot of them, I mean, they're mostly visual ones, because, at least in terms of the way that I was conceiving the book, if, like, that image of Jimmy Carter, say, and the 1977 World Series where Howard Cosell was supposed to have said that the Bronx was burning but didn't actually say that, if those two visual images are, like, what accounted for the the nation sort of knowing the Bronx as this particular place, then most of the things that I wanted to write about were visual images that and sort of engaged with that particular myth, either subverted it, echoed it, or otherwise engaged with it so that it either pushed it closer to a bit of reality or pushed it even further out into and deeper into that myth. But no, that would be that I think would be amazing for maybe another book. I mean, this is my first book, and by saying first, that means that I hope I write another one. So.
How about one more from David Hobbs? He'd like to ask about the Apocrypha and rumor. Researching New York City can be so fun and so challenging because knowing about the city's history and the history of your block even is such a point of pride, and so many counter histories are held beyond traditional archives. Were there any stories you wanted to include that you couldn't quite substantiate, or that you had to develop new research methods to pursue?
Man, I mean, so one of the things that actually led me to the 1980s archive of photos was trying to find the particular building that Gordon Matta Clark made his very first building cuts in. This was this series of works called Bronx Floors. And so that involved going to the municipal archives.
And he would just cut, maybe you should quickly explain.
Yeah, please.
No, you should.
Oh. Well, you read the book. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, so the Gordon Matta Clark would essentially, he had architectural training and took a sawzall, like a circulating saw, and cut holes into walls and floors of abandoned buildings, and sort of revealed the underlying architectures of spaces, and took photographs that sort of made one dizzy because you could see through something that you normally wouldn't ordinarily see. And so I was looking for this other origin point of this particular work, and I was able to find it, at least in the 1930s photographs, like a 1940s version of this building. And one of the very, very enormously helpful photo curators there, Michael Lorenzini, hipped me to this 1980s archive, which I think now is actually accessible online. If you go to the Municipal Archives website, you can search the entirety of the 1980s archive. And I mean, that sort of little bit of detective work of trying to find this street in this photograph that Matta Clark had taken of the exterior of the building had led me to this particular secondary archive. And I could tell a much longer story about that 1980s archive was one that was the first one ever put entirely onto laser discs, which was both enormously futuristic for that point in time. And as we all know, the story of the laser disc did not extend much beyond that particular point in time. So it was both something that was way too next and also not next enough. And that's one little half archival story, which I could tell a few more, but I know that we're short on time.
Well, thank you, Peter and Hua. Thank you so much. This was amazing. To everyone who was here tonight, thanks for being a great audience. And please, if you can, buy the book. The link is in the chat. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Maris. Thanks, McNally Jackson.
Thanks, Maris. Thanks, McNally Jackson. Shout out to Lindsay Waters. Hope you signed on. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming. Cheers.